Thank you, Manfred. It's my pleasure to introduce Judi Coburn, the author of Rebellion's Daughter and a retired teacher from City of York Board and the Metro Board, Toronto District School Board. And I was introduced to Judi when this book came out, and a mutual acquaintance of ours, Peter Dorfman, told me about this book, and he knew I had been the coordinator for history and social studies, and he lent me a copy. The book was published back in October 2021, and I read it, and it's the best novel that I have read in years. It's dramatic, exciting, and really explores the life of Canadians in the first half of the 19th century, and particularly a young woman, Eunice Whiting, who lived, and she was about 15 at just before the rebellion, and the book follows her for about 5 or 6 years of her life. And Judi will talk about her ability to do the historical research and what she was actually able to find, and then how she decided to weave this in to a very interesting study about the place of women in 19th century society, the challenging workload of people and farmers and tradespeople, the place of immigrants in society, the relation between men and women, and the health issues. Eunice's younger sister died of diphtheria, and her mother and brother died of cholera. And most of us would have said, oh yes, 5 years ago, just said, oh yeah, epidemics. Well, after the last 2 years, we really can empathize in a much more meaningful way. And it's a very powerful dimension to this book. Judi came upon the name Eunice Whiting in her copy of Charles Dickens' book, American Notes, that he wrote on his tour of North America in the 1840s. And it piqued her curiosity. And she'll explain the actual amount of historical evidence she was able to draw on. And then she's done a brilliant job of creating a wonderful young woman living a life. And she marries at the age of 15. She gets separated because of the rebellion and her husband joining the rebels, going to Navy Island and off to the States. And her need to find work as a milkmaid, or she even impersonates young men and gets a job for a time in a logging camp, and ends up having to move from household to household. And it's a really challenging life that people faced at this time. And of course, it also, weaves in the political issues between reformers and Tories, and the difference in class between well-off hotel owners and business owners and hardworking people who are just trying to get ahead. So I turn it over to Judi, and she'll share her journey with the development of Rebellion's Daughter. And I urge all of you to join Charlie and I, who have read the book. It's fantastic. And I actually bought a number of copies and gave them as Christmas presents to some of the nieces and women in my life. So over to you, Judi.
Thanks, Alan. That was very kind. I was a little worried you were going to steal my show by just everyone about the book, but um, I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about Rebellion's Daughter. I thought writing it was a solitary activity, but publishing under COVID has been also a very strange, lonely bubble. So my sincere thanks to Alan and my other invitees for this chance to talk about Eunice and the 1837 rebellion that I learned a lot about. As Alan said, I'm going to talk mainly about the research process because I want you to read the book. It became an all-consuming activity that went on for 18 years. And Dickens refers to it as the insurrection of 1837, which is a loaded term these days. Not all insurrections are built of the same material, but they are a big teaching moment. And if I were still teaching, I would handle this period differently. So if I don't go on too long, there should be lots of time to ask questions. As Alan said, it all began 2 decades ago when a good journalist friend of mine, who was doing an issue for the New Internationalist magazine on the evils of prison, spoke of meeting with the curator of the Kingston Penitentiary Museum, a lovely man. The curator told him that if he knew of anyone looking for a good story, they should check out this 17-year-old female imprisoned from 1839 to 1842, the young Eunice Whiting, who, although arrested for horse theft, was reputedly a rebel in the rebellion, disguised as a boy. And to say the least, this was pretty intriguing. As a history teacher, I always was looking for ways to hook my students, and storytelling, in my opinion, is key. It had proved pretty successful with publication of my first novel, The Shacklands, about one family's experiences during the 1907 flood of English poor to the old city of York, where I was teaching. And well, the untold story of Eunice Whiting sounded like it would be a very lively tale. And then when I found out that the young Charles Dickens, during his visit to the prison, had spotted Eunice, written about her, I was hooked. So I started with Dickens, and I even have a picture of the young Dickens. Is this working? My screen sharing? Are we good? Yes.
Yes, it's on the screen, Judy. Thank you.
Okay. So he had visited North America in 1842, had traveled extensively by train and steamboat and stagecoach in the eastern states and then north to Canada. And his powers of observation are very acute, often humorous, often acute like a surgeon's knife. He travels to Upper Canada. He stops briefly in Niagara, where he decries the graffiti. Then to Toronto, where he pens a very vivid account of the recent Election Day violence, during which a man was killed. And then on to Kingston to view the prison. His description of Kingston, a very poor town, one half appears to be burned down and the other half not to be built up. And he goes on to make the following observation of the prisoner Eunice Whiting, which I'm just going to read. It's just a paragraph. Among the women was a beautiful girl of 20 who had been there nearly 3 years. She acted as a bearer of secret dispatches for the self-styled patriots on Navy Island during the Canadian insurrection, sometimes attiring herself as a boy and secreting them in the lining of her hat. In the latter character, she always rode as a boy would, which was nothing to her, for she could govern any horse that she could lay her hands on. And this offense had brought her where I saw her. She had quite a lovely face, though there was a lurking devil in her bright eye, which looked out pretty sharply from between her prison bars. This passage indicated to me that Dickens might have engaged in quite a conversation with Eunice to be privy to this amount of detail. And I realized after all the years of research that this passage was probably the closest I ever came to hearing Eunice's voice. I was told that riding four in hand was controlling a team of 4 horses, which would be hauling a heavy load, either booze, logs, or a coach. So clearly an unusual young woman. I open my story with a scene of the young Dickens musing after he's returned to England about this encounter. And I took the liberty of describing their conversation as one that infuriated Eunice. Notwithstanding Dickens' obvious empathy with the poor, I still found it hard not to imagine that he was a very self-confident, well-dressed, privileged young man who would infuriate a committed rebel who didn't take well to a fancy pants who seemed to be shopping for good stories. So the next step was to find the 1839 court record of her arrest for horse theft, which had a very short paper trail, but gave me a location. And this was followed by months of research in the death, birth, and marriage records of the provincial archives, research which finally produced a very gratifying aha moment. When I found a marriage of Eunice Whiting to Jacob Shanholtz in the Gore district in 1836. Alas, this was all before cell phones, so I do not have a screenshot of this rather essential, almost illegibly loopy handwritten document. Those of you who have done this kind of research know how difficult it is to read this. Beautiful, but not very communicative writing. So she was a very young bride. She would have been 15 in 1836. And then later with another hoop, which you do hear joyful outbursts in the archives, I discovered in the census reports that this Jacob Shanholtz, she married, had a family farm in Niagara, just outside of Chippewa. So we're talking the Niagara River, Chippewa is just above the falls, and I guess my mouse cursor doesn't have any effect on you. You can't see my mouse cursor, can you?
Oh, yes, we can see
you
it.
can.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yep.
So I'll stop doing mad circles with it. So her family farm was a mile and a half from Chippewa. So a mile and a half from Navy Island, which is just off the shore of Chippewa, right in the middle of the Niagara River. So it put her, very close to where William Lyon Mackenzie would try to build a new army of rebels after the rebellion that had floundered on Yonge Street had failed. So it verified for me that her rebel activities were very likely real. Whereas up to that point, I'd wondered whether she was not just a horse thief who'd had a good yarn to explain her arrest. I did a great deal of reading about the 1837 uprising. There are many good historians. Colin Reid was one of my main sources. He wrote extensively about it, lots of documentation. I found out that it had a great depth of popular support. I hadn't quite realized. One often overlooks this because of the rebellion seemed doomed. its leadership was spectacularly incompetent. William Lyon Mackenzie, he was a great orator, and he was a very fine muckraking journalist, but a terrible military leader. And it is also said prone to drink. But Reed's research documents huge outdoor gatherings that were held regularly around the province to discuss the issues of the day: the lack of roads, the absence of schools, of fair courts, of election day violence, of patronage and land scandals. There were angry protests against the very small group of rich families that controlled the life in the small province. Legislation that the reform-minded assembly passed would simply be tossed out by, I should have included a picture of Sir Bondhead, as he was called, Bonehead. I must do that because he does look like a bit of a English twit. So I learned that the uprising went far beyond the scattering of rebels on Yonge Street, that many people, including myself, connect with the Upper Canada Rebellion. In fact, it went on for another 2 years, armed attacks in Niagara, Point Pelee, Windsor, Prescott. It was not only Matthew Lount and Peter Matthews that were hung, but a dozen other rebels met that fate. And 100 more were shipped to Breakstone in Van Diemen's Land in Australia. And I frankly felt embarrassed as a history teacher that I had not read more about this really very pivotal moment in the development of democracy in our province. The Niagara Peninsula was a hotbed of support for the rebels. Go back to the map. Not only was there Mackenzie's idea, quite an insane idea, of building an army on this tiny island in the middle of the Niagara River, but when that failed, 6 months later, there was another plan for a massive rebel attack, a plan that went dismally awry when a regiment of rebels attacked prematurely and were routed. This attack occurred in the once bustling village of St. John's, which had been a big commercial hub until the Welland Canal was built, and it fell into what it is now today, a ghost town. So the rebels had planned to attack St. John's with the aim of taking the weapons of the group of lancers who were posted there. So this meant that Eunice was very nearby this attack. Her farm would have been a short ride from St. John's. I became immersed in the details of the Niagara activities, largely because of a wonderful Niagara teacher and local history expert, Colin Dukeman. He wrote a book, a small book, The Niagara Frontier in the Upper Canada Rebellion, in which he provides amazing political and biographical detail on all the characters involved. He provides maps showing the routes of the rebels. So this is the town of St. John's. This is 12 Mile Creek, for those of you who might be familiar with the Niagara area. St. Catharines is just to the north, and Niagara on the Lake just to the east. Yes. Coming from Saskatchewan, I just have to say I had a great problem with the geography of the Niagara Peninsula. I'm used to things being very square and could never quite get my head around why you had to go west from Niagara to get east to Toronto until I, figured out the head of the lake. Just a Saskatchewan confession. Anyway, the rebels attacked the Ostra Hoots Tavern, which is right here, they won the day. They took the weapons, they defeated the Lancers, but they were very quickly rounded up by the Canadian Army, which would have been largely militia, but also contained soldiers. Okay. Dukeman's book introduced me to various characters in this attack. There was Ben Waits and his very formidable wife, Maria, who I wish I had a picture of. He is sentenced to death for his part in the rebellion, in this attack on St. John's. He's sentenced to death, and his wife travels first to Quebec City to plead with Lord Durham for her husband's life, and then to England to obtain a pardon for him when he's sentenced to life breaking stone in Tasmania. And I was introduced by Colin to Judge Jones, I call the hanging judge, who pronounced death sentences on Eunice's friends who would have been involved in this attack, and who keeps popping up in the trials of rebels all over the province. A judge who I felt quite vindicated in turning into quite a villain in the novel. I have the pleasure of giving Eunice an opportunity to slap his face, which was fun to write. Judge Jones. So now it was much easier to imagine, if I can go back to the map, Eunice running messages for these rebels. So her farm would be here. She would run a message in my story to the Quaker village, which was the Quakers were ardent supporters of democratic reform, and then to the rebels who'd been hiding in the woods just south of St. John's. And I also have to imagine her message is one that inflames the attack, that gives them reason to go ahead with the premature attack. So she is devastated by the attack's failure and her part in it, and certainly by the hanging of one of the rebels involved. My local historian, Colin, suggested that I camp out near the town of St. John's on the same day of the month as the attack, just to get a sense of the flora and fauna that Eunice might have experienced. And so I did, and it was very instructive. Only after the grade 8 graduation party that was going on at the other end of the campground had finally quietened down. But yeah, the clover smell was heady, the bats circled, the owls called, bullfrogs groaned from a pond, and in the morning, a turtle appeared right beside my tent to dig a hole to bury her eggs. So this turtle, or maybe her great-great-grandmother, even make it into Eunice's story. Despite, I should move off the turtle. Despite being unable to pinpoint Eunice's actual family in the records, I have her fictional family face the tragedy of fatal illness, as Alan was describing. I know the source of the cholera outbreak of 1832 was concluded to have been the drinking water made available during a visit of a traveling menagerie to the town of Galt. So I have her family travel in a very excited moment to see a menagerie, and it has fatal results. I know the outbreak took 200 lives, and it could well have touched Eunice's family. I wanted to convey how very tentative survival was in that period. When I began writing, I had launched into Eunice's involvement with the Niagara rebels with little backstory. But I realized I needed to go deeper into her motivation for taking on such risky involvement with a group of armed rebels. I decided that one reason she might have so quickly taken up the torch to bring down the government could have come from her own experience of injustice, her own experience of bullies. I certainly have no evidence that her father was abusive, but it resonates with her fierce determination to see justice done. It might explain running from her family and marrying so young. I have her land on her feet with a very lively newspaper reading reform family around whose table she learns about the political situation and falls in love with her future husband, Jacob. Jacob does disappear from her life as she becomes more embroiled in the conflict. And I had to answer for this. And an answer was provided by another aha moment at the National Archives in Ottawa, where I found the Niagara militia rolls from the rebellion period. Jacob's two brothers appear in these lists of men who turned out to support the government, but not Jacob. Although he certainly would have been called up to serve, as all men over 18 were obliged. So it reinforced my notion that Eunice had married a man with strong reform sympathies, a man who had been her political mentor, a man who would have fled in order to join Mackenzie on Navy Island, and still leaves the likelihood that he would have had trouble with a young wife who desperately wanted to share in rebellion action. I was struck over and over again in the research how bloody awful civil wars are, when neighbors turn against neighbors and when families are split down the middle. I tried to give some picture of this both in the scenes with her husband's family, a brother and sister-in-law who are opposed to Jacob and Eunice's politics, and also in the sad fate of the politically active family that she first lived with. They lived in, the Grouse family, who she first lives with, lived in the Gore district, where there was a lot of activity and a roundup of rebel sympathizers ended up in hundreds being thrown in jail, along with the man that headed the family, the reform family. Upper Canada was divided into, there were those who were very loyal to Britain, and not just the wealthy, but people who feared the revolutionaries to the south. Most of history teachers are very familiar with this. But it was impressed upon my memory again, the violence of the period. So the people who feared the American revolutionaries, who had not only tossed out the British, but had invaded Canada in the War of 1812, which was only 25 years earlier, so fresh in people's memories. These were people who feared democracy, who believed that wresting power away from the ruling families would result in chaos. And of these, the Orangemen were a particularly violent group. Then there were large areas of Upper Canada which had been settled by other immigrants. Thousands were Americans in search of land, not Empire loyalists, but from diverse backgrounds. Pennsylvania Dutch, like my mother's family, farmers and tradesmen and professionals who had great sympathy for elected governments and a strong antipathy towards the monarchy and privileged elites. So it was an extremely divided province. And elections were very violent affairs. No secret ballot. You stood up and publicly proclaimed your vote. And for the reformers, this often meant being clubbed, a scene I depict. Likely more than anything else, the sense that the 1836 election had been stolen from the reformers. In this case, unlike recently, really stolen through voter intimidation and generous dolings of land patents. And the anger drove settlers to gather behind leaders who saw no other way to get justice. A member of the legislature, a Dr. Duncombe, who I hadn't been introduced to before. Nope. Oh, all right, I have changed an order here. Yes, Dr. Duncombe, who Eunice meets, went to England with a well-documented evidence of all of the widespread election fraud and violence, and was turned away like a bothersome fly. But then there was the large population of Indigenous people anxiously watching their lands fill with white settlers. Those pertinent to, I should probably go back to the map here, maybe back to the map. Those pertinent to Eunice's travels would have been the Six Nations, the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Tuscarora, many of whom themselves were immigrants from the United States, from America. Their settlements, like the Mohawk villages along the Hudson Valley and in the USA, had been burned by American revolutionaries during the War of Independence. They had joined forces with the British, but were driven north. And then again in 1812, they had fought alongside the British and Canadian forces to drive back the Yankee aggressors, and had been given this large tract of land along the Grand River by the British in recognition of their support and their bravery. So it's not surprising that the Six Nations did not support the rebels of 1837, saw them as yet another generation of Yankees seeking to oust them from their lands. There was a regiment of Mohawk warriors that took part in the roundup of Eunice's friends, Eunice's rebel friends. So I make sure that Eunice meets them on the road now. William Johnson Kerr, the captain of this Mohawk regiment, was a member of the Tory elite. He was a man who hated William Lyon Mackenzie with a passion, beat him up at one point. But his mother was the daughter of a notable Mohawk woman, and Kerr himself married Elizabeth Brant, who was daughter of Joseph Brant, the Mohawk leader. So I try to weave into Eunice's experiences some idea of these complications. History is far from a straight line. And similarly complicated is the story of the Black community in Niagara, who also did not support the rebels, escaping north to a British colony from their enslavement at the hands of Americans, made them also unwilling to join these rebels. And Eunice would have been aware of these tensions, for it was at the time she moves to Niagara. Nope. Map. It's at the time when she moves to Niagara with her husband that 2 Black community members are killed during a large protest against the extradition of a former slave. I imagine that rumors of Eunice's involvement with the rebels would force her to flee the Niagara area. And I took the liberty of offering her employment at a historic inn, the Toll House Inn between Paris and Brantford, near to my mother's family farm. The inn, during it's more auspicious days. And it's a kind of sad 1950s picture. It's now been demolished, but at the time it was a quite infamous inn, locally known as the Bucket of Blood. And the proprietor actually was a woman named Two Gun Kate. I have to confess, the woman managed the inn in a slightly later time period than my Eunice, but I found a character called Two Gun Kate too hard to pass up. Not only was the Bucket of Blood and close to my family history, but an 1856 map shows that the Dr. Charles Duncombe, who I spoke of earlier, had extensive lands very close to my own family's farm. Dr. Duncombe, I think I go back to his, yes, prominent local doctor. He owned a lot of land, a seemingly unlikely revolutionary, actually leads a very large rebel army from the London district. It was supposed to combine with Mackenzie's army to bring down the government, but was a disastrous failure. So back to Eunice. Nope, not yet, not yet. We'll go map, not the turtle, the map. I have 6 months to account for before her arrest. And so I imagine that her inability to keep her opinions to herself got her into serious trouble and fired from the inn. The slapping of Judge Jones was involved. She's fired from the inn. She has to leave a promising romance to take up her boy's identity again and work as a horse minder in a lumber camp. This is the reference to her boast to Dickens of riding four in hand better than any man. There are lots of historical examples of women taking on men's identities, but I found these sections of the book very trying to write. The need for opportunities to change clothing, to be able to pee, to hide your breasts and your hair, to pull on and off the laced corset, to have to adjust your demeanor, your talk, your swagger, and all the time living with the constant fear of discovery. It's hard to imagine pulling it off. I imagined that there were those who knew of her rebel involvement and were looking for her, which keeps her on the move. And as a boy looking for employment, she's facing the squalid conditions on the road for men looking for work, overflowing chamber pots and lice-infected mattresses. It also gave me a chance to throw in this time period that I'm accounting for. It gave me a chance to throw in my great-grandfather, who was a blind Methodist circuit rider at the time. I'm not going to give away much more about her arrest than to say that the man whose horse she stole was a prominent character, a man who owned, among many other businesses, the American House, at the time a grand hotel in Waterdown, just up the escarpment from Dundas and Hamilton. It's an establishment that has survived. It still exists. It's no longer so posh, although this picture doesn't really indicate much poshness, but it still exists and it still serves a good lunch. So after her arrest, I knew she had 5 weeks in the jail in Hamilton, which was a very impressive building from the time. And then 5 weeks in jail awaiting trial and then awaiting the steamer that carried her to Kingston Penitentiary. One has to thank the amount of paper the legal system uses. I know everyone who was in jail with her in the Hamilton jail. This would have been in the basement of the Hamilton jail. I know their crimes, their ages, their names. I know those prisoners that were chained alongside her when she was taken by steamboat to Kingston. Without this one single marriage document, which exposed Eunice's married name, and then the link to all these legal records of courts and jails, Eunice's story would have left no trail at all. And this is all the more true of Eunice's time in Kingston Penitentiary, which she arrives at late at night by steamboat. Through the godsend of a fellowship I received to study the penitentiary records, I know a good deal about the 12 or so women she was imprisoned with for 3 years. I know their ages, several were only 12. I know their likely nationalities from their names, the crimes they committed, with 2 exceptions. They were all petty thefts, things like cloaks and quilts and food. I know their heights and complexions. Petty thievery got a year sentence, unless you repeated, which many did, and then you got 2 years. There was a 14-year-old Rhoda with whom she tried to escape. The warden's account of this escape was riveting reading. There was a young Black prisoner, Grace, whose ideas seriously challenge Eunice. There was a young woman, Bridget, who was driven quite mad and hauled off to what was referred to as the hole numerous times. There were abusive guards. There was a strict rule of silence, which when broken earned the culprit whippings. 3 girls aged 12 to 16 were frequently whipped in Eunice's last year there. It was brutal, and you would have had to have been an extremely tough nut not to be crushed by it. A few years ago, I took one of the tours offered upon the closing of Kingston Penitentiary, hoping to get a sense of what imprisonment might have felt like. The stone walls many put in place while she was there by the male prisoners themselves are amazingly thick and the air clammy and echoing. And standing within the walls, I had hoped to feel some connection with the character I had made real in my imagination. But instead, I just felt overwhelmed by the thousands of undocumented stories those stone buildings contain. I hope my portrayal of Eunice during those tough prison years is not too naive, but I chose to imagine her strong sense of justice denied was not extinguished, but instead was strengthened. I have tried to create a plausible story of a young woman whose fury against injustice becomes more and more sophisticated with her experiences, and also to tell the story of a rebellion that tragically failed, but also galvanized support that would, within a decade, succeed in overthrowing an authoritarian colonial system. I have tried to touch on some of the things that struck me while doing the research and the writing, but I'm very happy now to turn it back to my audience out there, and would be happy to hear any questions you might have.
Well, thank you, Judi.
Judy, I'm going to end the screen share.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do I hit stop share?
Yes.
Okay.
Very good.
And does that mean I won't see you anymore?
Oh no, you'll see us just fine.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Okay. Good.
There we go.
Honest.
And I'm already starting to put together the list of questioners. But back to you, Manfred.
I was just going to say,
yeah.
in our own group, Judy, we have a former Yorkie too, Roy Evely, who is a distant relative of Samuel Lount, right?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So whenever we talked about rebellion, and that included Ontario politics, he said, "Yeah, I have a rebellious streak in me too." But yeah. So anyway, and I'll come back when we're done the Q&A. But thanks for that. Okay.
So I see two names, two people so far. It's Charlie and Liz. Anyone else? Wave your hand at the screen. And if, as things go along, you can raise your hand. So go ahead, Charlie. Unmute yourself, sir. Charlie, you're muted. Yeah.
Okay. Well, congratulations, Judy. This is a terrific book in all kinds of ways. First of all, it's really exciting. There are a lot of very, very gripping episodes in this book where this Eunice gets herself into trouble, and most of the time she gets out of it somehow. But first of all, I see the book really as a story of two rebellions that are going on here. The first is, of course, the rebellion against the family compact. If I could just say personally here, any other work I've read on the family compact rebellion, I remember going back to The Firebrand by William Kilbourne, but it deals with Mackenzie and deals with Toronto and so forth. And the other one was a play by Rick Salutin, who was a star reporter, 1837. They dealt, I think, more in the Toronto area, and I really didn't know too much about what was going on in the Niagara Peninsula, even though I had taught this area. But in any case, I see two rebellions going on. The major one, but the second one is Eunice herself, and she really is rebelling, the way I see it, against sort of a Victorian ideal of femininity, not always observed, but what Victorian women were supposed to be like, especially in the upper classes. They were supposed to be, of course, subordinate to men. They were not supposed to be political. They were to defer to men. They were sort of supposedly on the delicate side and so forth. Well, Eunice was in complete rebellion against this. When you look at her qualities here, first of all, she's tough as hell physically. All that farm work, all that ability to work in logging camps, to paddle canoes and so forth. Secondly, she's mouthy as hell. She cannot keep her mouth shut, really. And of course, it gets her into trouble because she has tremendously strong political views. She can't stay away from horses. She wants to steal them. She loves these animals. So in many ways, she is really in rebellion, as I saw it. That gives this book its punch and its sort of its narrative power, as I saw it. The book as well, is filled with all kinds of interesting details of what life is back then. Cheese making, dairy making, just everyday living that these people went through. The only disappointment I suppose I had in the book, and it's strange. Eunice, what happened to her after prison? I wonder what did happen when she finally got out after that grueling time that she spent in prison. Do you have any ideas of what might have happened, or is just the trail ended at that point?
Well, thank you for those comments. Two rebellions, I think, is quite accurate. I do know something, and I did hint at it in the postscript where I indicate what I do know about Eunice Whiting, and I just hint that she had not seen the last of Kingston Penitentiary.
Okay.
So there have been many questions whether a sequel might, be coming.
Okay.
Hate to steal the show here, but
No.
she steals another horse and ends up back in prison. So what she was doing is, up to the imagination of anyone who takes on the project. But she does end up back in prison, and it would be interesting. It would be an interesting path to follow, because she would be in prison with Grace Marks of Margaret Atwood's alias Grace. She would have been in prison at the same time as Grace Marks. So just an interesting.
Right.
Note.
Do you intend to write a sequel to it? Maybe.
I'm not there yet, but certainly Eunice is, having created her is over such a period of time, is hard to get rid of from my mind. So who knows? It could happen. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. Next question, it comes from Liz. And yeah, you're unmuting yourself. Great. And then after that, I think I saw Alan's hand. So Liz, go ahead, please.
Hey, Liz.
Hi. Yeah, I was absolutely fascinated by the pictures that you showed, and your description of your tour through Kingston Penitentiary. And I was just wondering if you had thought of adding those pictures to the book, because I think it gives the book a different kind of density when people see it rooted in that historical reality.
That's a good point. Pictures for me are key to, being able to, I'm a visual person, so it's very helpful to have pictures of some of these characters to try to get inside their story, what their story might have been. So that's an interesting, if there's a reprint, if it just goes off the shelves like crazy.
or even to put in the book a link to a website that maybe you put maybe the recording of this session on, or the pictures, or some way of just sort of adding that historical truth that photographs document to the book.
Right. Just to point out that Liz and I worked on the production of Shacklands, my first novel, and it has many photographs in it of of the period, which add a lot to the story, I think. Yeah. Good point.
All right, thank you. Alan, did you have a question? Is that why you had your thumbs up before earlier?
No, I was just agreeing with some points Charlie made, and you can come back to me. I'll pass it over for Jim Mile.
I didn't see Jim's hand up, but sorry about. There you go, Jim. Sure, you're up. You're on, man.
Hello, Judi.
Hello.
I was wondering about the trial that she faced. Was the evidence at all persuasive, or was it a trumped-up charge? Was it the judge just wanted to make an example of her? What did you learn in your research?
She certainly stole the horse. And so I don't have the transcripts. I don't have any transcripts of the trial in 1839. I did find the transcripts for her second charge of horse theft, after my story ends, which are pretty interesting. So I don't have the transcript. I don't hear the witnesses in her first trial. So she clearly stole Mr. Griffin's horse. I think it was an open and shut case.
Hello.
Is that a typical sentence, 3 years for stealing something like a horse?
3 years, a sentence?
Or 3 years or whatever it was, 3 years or 4 years?
3 years. And as I point out when she's going in the steamboat, the fellow beside her also stole a horse and he got 5 years. So I think because of her age or maybe her gender, she got 3 years. That was standard. Horse theft was, I think of it as being somewhat similar to hot wiring a car. I mean, but a very common crime, because in order to get anywhere, and you can't call a cab, you can't, so yeah, she loved horses, but she also had to get from A to B, I think was.
Thank you.
Well, doesn't look like there are any more questions. I think you you may have answered. Oh, wait a minute. Alan just pops up. Go ahead, Alan.
Yes, you are very effective and dramatic in describing her riding the horses and that. Have you, been a horse user or owner or that? How did you get that authentic feeling?
Well, I'm glad you say it's authentic, because I worried about it a lot, as did my sister-in-law, who owns horses and tried to give me some riding lessons and just shook her head in dismay that I was not born to the saddle. So I'm very glad they came across as authentic passages, because I'm not a horse person. But she did try to give me, I had to put on a saddle in front of her, so I would know the parts and, the difficulties, and I tried galloping across a field, with a very sore rear end for days. So I am not a horse person, but I'm glad I managed to fake it.
Well, once again, thank you. Oh, Jim, go ahead.
May I ask a further question? I was thinking about your experience writing the book, which is, I think some authors say, is a very lonely thing to do, and you really have to hide yourself away. What do you think were your problems in writing a book, and how did you manage to overcome them and actually produce a book?
Well, it is a lonely experience, except that I was teaching part-time for quite a number of the years of writing the book. So in my last 3 years of teaching, I was teaching creative writing. So I actually tried out a few chapters on my creative writing class. So that that made it not so lonely. And students were very happy to critique a teacher's writing, put the other foot. So actually I had the great advantage of teaching at the same time as writing, and being able to try out a few things. I found the research fascinating. So I mean, it is lonely being stuck away in archives, but it is also very exciting. Those aha moments are really worth, weeks of trying to decipher 19th century writing. I don't know. They must have spent a great deal of time learning how to do those loopy, not loopy writing, but so I didn't find it oppressive. I have to say the research was quite exciting, and I did have the benefit of teaching at the same time. That didn't make it so lonely a process. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Alan.
Yes, I was just wondering, Judi, if you could let people know how they can order the book or buy the book?
Oh, thank you, Alan. Thanks to this forum, I called up Indigo and said, you know, you don't have my book on your shelves, but I'm giving a presentation and could you please order some? And they said, oh, sure, we'll order 20. So I know that Indigo on Bloor has copies, Type Books on Queen West has copies, and Book City, St. Clair and Young has copies. All due to this forum, because unless I had some reason for them to order it, they seem reluctant. So those 3 bookstores I know, and you can order it also from the publisher, Fernwood Publisher, just takes a little longer. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. And I think Chris said he had a link to the publisher on the website. He can just fill us in.
Yes, if you go to the event page, and I guess that the event page would be, there may be some difficulty navigating backwards in time to a calendar item on our website. So what I will do, because we're recording this, what I will do is I will make a not a page, but a posting on our website. And so it can be searched at any time. And the posting will include the link to the recording. And in addition to that, I'll put the link to the publisher's website and some little background information with respect to you and the history of the book.
And maybe list the bookstores.
Sure. Indigo available at Indigo, Book City, and via Fernwood Publishers. Sure.
And Type Books. Yeah.
Is it TYPE?
Yeah.
Is that a bookstore?
Yeah.
Okay, right. Okay, good. Another question and or comment from Liz.
So are you going to pitch it for a TV series?
I think it would make a great TV series.
Absolutely.
Yeah, apparently you have to have a screen, what do you call it? Treatment.
Scriptwriter.
Screenplay.
Before they will look at it. So if you know any screenwriters.
I know 2 people in the biz though.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk. No, I think it would make, I think, you know, it would, Anne with an E would, you know, pass into the background.
But don't wait for the screen presentation. Buy and read the book first.
Absolutely.
Shall I send it back to you, Manfred?
Well, sure. Judi, if we've been able to have an in-person event, as we had for most of our past, we would have asked you, of course, to bring copies of the book and possibly, you know, autograph them on the spot. So this is part of the disadvantage of being limited to online. But, you know, like Charlie, and being Toronto based, knowing what went on in that rebellion period outside of the Toronto area, shall we say, you know, and then mostly focused on Mackenzie, having been the first mayor of our new city, it limited. And of course, there was a whole lower Canada rebellion going on too with other
Yes.
countries. And,
Yeah.
but, you know, in writing a paper at university, I came across an era about a decade later, which had a rebellious streak, but with corporate sources. And that was the annexation movement of 1849, based largely in Montreal, where the nowadays highly touted Canadian businesses of Molson's and Redpath were toying seriously with the idea of leaving this loose confederation of colonies and hooking up with the states, because they saw the more natural business connections with New York, Philadelphia, and Boston than they did with this little ribbon of colonies, you know. So the flirtation with American republicanism didn't stop with this 37 rebellion, you know. So we have that amongst us, and it just depends who foments it, you know. And luckily that annexation movement was nipped in the bud too, but that accelerated Confederation along with the Civil War then in the US, of course. But listen, wonderful to see you, first of all.
Yeah,
and then,
yeah, you too.
Our small grouping had a disproportionate number of former City of Yorkers participating, and so that was nice to see too. But we're gonna, obviously, we already in our December newsletter issue promoted your book, and I think we're going to have a review in the upcoming one, which is going to all the membership because it's a hard copy mailing. So you're going to have, you know, over 500 more people find out about your book if they didn't already know.
Super.
Yeah, and if we put in the promotions around where they can get it, and you know, that'll help. But I also want to let the folks here know that Judi's progressive cred even manifests itself, because what we have done in the past, of course, is always offered either a speaker's fee or an opportunity to identify a charity of choice to make a donation. And Judi has decided to offer her speaker's fee to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. So, you know, kudos again, and we'll facilitate that, Judi. So, yeah, so on behalf of the small group, of course, the dedicated people, I see, yeah, they're clapping it. Thanks again for your time, and we hope that the book sales just skyrocket after this opportunity.
Right, and watch for the TV special.
Well, that's right, and maybe a sequel too, right? So I should tell you too that you know, we would love you to join our group as our members, right? Because the next 6 months will be heavily politically oriented with both the provincial and the municipal elections. So I can talk to you afterwards about how to do that. But you know, I think you would be a perfect new addition to our 500 plus membership base. So thanks again. And I want to mention that besides checking our website, of course, regularly, we've got our next event on April 20th, which we're still having to see if we can have it actually in person or online, and that would be the West End activity we normally have. But the focus of that will be the election, and we're going to have a provincial staffer who's in charge of the overall federation pre-election planning as our presenter. So either in person or online. I think that's a good one that you should note down.
I'd be very interested. Yeah.
You know, and so maybe by then you might also have decided to join our merry little group. That would be great. But yeah, so March we're not putting on an event per se, because it's March break, but also the provincial assembly is on, and I will be monitoring that on our behalf. But so listen, thanks again. And unless anybody has any further comments, Chris, thanks for organizing this again, the Zoom call.
Very welcome.
Yes,
and Dawn,
thank you for getting me through it.
Yeah, Dawn, Eileen,
No
glad to
problem
see
at
you,
all.
of course. And reunions, even without many words spoken, are still valuable, right? So.
Oh, it's lovely to